24. In the waves of what he would have called static, had he known any words or had any memories to liken things to, he was noticing that some bits were different from others. Comparatively speaking, this was a fascinating new development. Thinking about it didn't get him anywhere. It was just a reality to which he was being passively subjected. He could not lean forward to examine it more closely. He could not move around to look at it from different angles. All he could do was wait, like one trapped in sleep paralysis, for the next surge, and then attend to it, and try to confirm this growing idea that not all parts of it were the same, that there were patterns, or at least variations that his attention could lock onto. His emotions shifted. For a long time, or so it seemed now that he was experiencing something like time, he had feared the onset of the static and longed for it to subside. It had caused him something like pain. His growing ability to see variation within it was changing this. When the hissing, sparkling wave subsided, he was eager for it to return and anxious that it might not. Then a thing happened with a quickness that was extraordinary compared to all that had gone before, which was that his thoughts of creases and grooves and worn paths in his mind's turnings came together with certain of the motes that were somehow different to form a thing that he could hold steady in his regard, and experience and study for a while, before it fell apart under the too great pressure of his mind's desperate grasp and broke down into the flickering motes from which it had self-assembled. But the next time the wave returned, he could cast about for it again, and sometimes find or at least glimpse it. Or perhaps he was reconstructing it anew each time. If so, he must coax it into being with the infinite patience he had built during the eons before. It didn't matter. He saw it a few, then many times. The thing had properties. Lacking words, or even the idea of words, he could behold those properties but not keep them in his mind when the thing was not there before him. It was as if the thought waves that he had over minutes or centuries or eons, identified as creases or grooves, had taken on a form that he could behold. It was the first and only thing with a form. All else was static. When he beheld different parts of it, or moved his regard from one part to an adjoining part, he perceived turnings and features that were expressions of the creases and grooves that his mind had worn into itself, sometimes branching in one direction, sometimes another. That it had parts distributed in such a way, a stem here, serrated edges there, veins branching this way and that, hit him hard as, at once, a vast revelation, and at the same time so old and obvious that it was second nature. The thing wasn't always the same. The branchings changed from one reconstruction of it to the next, but it was always the same kind of thing. One day, or year, or century, he was beholding this thing for the 100th, or 1,000th, or 1,000,000th time, and he knew somehow what it was. And sometime after that, the roar and hiss began to call to him strangely. In the same way as he had learned to see something in the waves of flickering static, he began to connect moments in the noise and to string them together into patterns he could recognize. The way they were organized one after the other was of a different nature from the way the static motes coalesced one beside the next into a thing that he could behold, but once he learned the knack of it, he was able to repeat this trick of stringing them together. The strung signals could be recognized as a thing no less sensible than the thing he had been looking at. It was a leaf. These ways of gathering static motes into patterns that he could hold in his regard, and stringing fragments of noise into sequences that he could recognize, spread first slowly, and then with too great speed for him to encompass. If he'd had access to a larger pool of memories, he might have likened it to a flame spreading across a pool of gasoline, or a crack propagating through a block of stone. That each leaf was a little different was no longer a source of confusion once he got the knack of distributing things around. He could summon forth as many leaves as he wished, and set one next to another. The space in which they abided became larger. By regarding one leaf or another with greater care, he was able to bring it into the center of his regard. He organized the leaves on bigger structures, themselves in a way leaf-like. Those were branches, and branches could be organized on trees, and he could make as many trees as he chose, and arrange them as he wished, haphazardly, which was a thing called a forest, or dotted around here and there, which was a park, or in neat rows, which was a street. He created one of each, a street lined with red-leaved trees, leading to a park with a forest beyond. As he gazed upon one tree or another, it would move closer to him, carrying all else along with it. When he grew accustomed to this, though, a change came over his thinking, and he found it more fitting to conceive of the trees and the other things as remaining in one place while he moved through it. To fix them in their places, he created the ground. By its nature, the ground did not alter its shape once he had brought it into being, for its purpose was to keep the trees and other things in a fixed relationship to one another. To serve that purpose, it had to be much larger than the trees and the other things that it contained. Therefore, it required the conversion of a vast expanse of static into something of an altogether different nature. The static was not easily tamed, but in time he learned how to change it into a thing dark and rigid and hard. And this was adamant. Once made, it would not alter its shape or its position unless he broke it once again into the static from which he had formed it, and made such alterations as he desired. The forest, the street, and the park were thus situated on an island of adamant that held its shape and position in the sea of static. In the early going, he'd had to build the leaf anew every time, but new things were now coming into being without his say-so, and he was stumbling upon them already made. He was rediscovering, becoming alive to, things that had been summoned and organized by him when he wasn't paying attention. He knew, for example, that the leaf was red. Indeed, they had emerged in the beginning from their redness. He'd seen motes that were different, and assembled them into the leaf. In the first eon he had ever been in some kind of torment, finding the static unendurable when it engulfed him, and fearing it would never abate, then, after it had gone away, sensing the possibility that it might never return, stranding him in darkness and silence. But it had now come and gone so many millions of times that he had altogether put aside those fears. The putting of names on things gave him power. He named the static chaos. Chaos was terrible, but he had learned the knack of summoning things forth out of it, and thereby mastered it. The waves still came and went, but the rhythm of their coming and going had become a part of him now. He named them day and night, and knew them as being good for different purposes. The day was when new things were drawn forth from chaos, perfected and beheld. The night was for resting, and for the naming of what had been drawn forth during the day. The street, the park, and the forest had at first wobbled in and out of existence and changed their shapes, but as he made it his way to inhabit them, walking up and down the street, strolling through the park, and looking into the forest, they became steady and ceased changing all the time. Leaves fell to the ground. He had no particular idea as to why this happened. To be a leaf was to fall. Early on there had been no ground to stop them. For that matter, there had been no up or down, just infinities of flickering chaos. But the trees seemed to want to be pointed in the same direction, with trunks down and leaves up, and the trunks had to stop somewhere, and the leaves had to land somewhere. In that somewhere, he began to see motes that were of a different nature, and yet not red. Beneath the trees' spreading branches, he made the ground all of a color which was not red, but green. Above, the trunks and branches took on another color, which was brown. Once the leaves had fallen and were lying still upon the ground, he would gaze at them and see that their redness was not all the same, but that there was variation from one part to another. Different shades of red, indeed different colors altogether. Purple near the tips, yellow in the creases. Beneath them, the green ground took on definition. No longer was it a featureless slab of adamant, but instead was itself built of tiny green leaves. Some were long and skinny, others short and round. Packed together in uncountable numbers, they made a variegated cushion upon which the leaves rested for his inspection. He would gaze upon one and note the variations in color and shape that made it different from other leaves, then turn his attention to another that had fallen next to it. When he turned back to the first leaf, he expected to see it lying in the same place. It was not correct for it to have moved or disappeared, or to have altered its color or its shape while he was looking elsewhere. In time he bettered the workings of the leaves and the ground so that the leaves stayed where they had fallen, and, having found a color and a shape, changed not. The fixing of the leaves transformed the street and the park in a way he had not forethought, in that leaves began to fall on top of other leaves and to cover them up. The green ground disappeared beneath them altogether, and their level began to climb up the trunks of the trees. He gazed up at the branches and understood the problem, which was that, although leaves fell from them unceasingly, the appearance of the trees never changed, and the number of leaves on them forever stayed the same. This, too, was a kind of wrongness that he had the power to better. Bettering such things was what he did. It was his reason for existing now. He made it so that the falling of each leaf left a bare place on the branch where it had been attached. Then, for the first time in all the days he had dwelled in the park and walked in the street, the appearance of the trees began to change. Their redness diminished, and their shape became patchy. After some number of days had gone by, only a few leaves remained clinging to the branches which had gone bare and brown, and the ground below was a deep lake of red. He missed the beauty of the red trees, and wished to see it again as it had been in the beginning. But he understood now that to place the leaves back on the branches and begin it anew would only lead to more leaves on the ground. He missed the green. The fallen leaves needed to be done away with if the street, the park, and the forest were ever to return to their original form. Yet the rules of the place, the rules he had through his ceaseless building and bettering, set into being, stated that fallen leaves did not move. For a long stretch of days and nights, he brooded over this problem, and it occurred to him that all of his efforts might have gone for naught, and that he might ought to let it all come apart into chaos again, and begin anew, or else abandon his foolish efforts to bring forth fixed and pleasurable things out of the dead terror of the chaos. One day, though, he noted a leaf that appeared different from the others, being of a darker color, and no longer flat but curled up at the tips and wrinkled in the middle. It was not as beautiful as the red leaves around it, yet something in it struck him as new and important to the problem that had been troubling him. He watched that leaf over days, as it grew darker and curled in upon itself. Then, one day after it had become nearly unrecognizable, he noticed that it had moved. He gazed at it in fascination, for he had long ago laid down the law that leaves did not move once fallen. After a long while, it moved again, as of its own volition. It did not disappear in one place and reappear in another, but lifted itself up from the pond of red leaves, moved across space, and settled down again, sometimes lighting at a different angle. It moved again, and finally took to the air and whirled away and was gone. So there was a way of getting rid of fallen leaves, but it required that they lose their beauty and be allowed to move about. Having labored for so many eons to create the beauty of the park and the street, he was fearful of letting all the leaves go. He had learned, though, to trust that sense of correctness that had guided him to this point. Ignoring it led sometimes quickly and sometimes over slow eons, first to troubling emotions, and then to the steady and relentless decoherence of all that he had so laboriously summoned into his regard. Obeying it, though it didn't always lead to results quickly, or at all, more often than not, made things better than they had been. And things that were better persisted and self-improved. Things that were shoddy frayed, sometimes while he wasn't looking, other times even as he gazed on helplessly, watching them dissolve into chaos. Seeing no other way to bring the leaves' beauty back, he suffered it to happen. The red lake turned brown over the course of many days, as the leaves all went the way of that first one. They began going into motion. At first they moved fitfully, each choosing its own course, but he sensed the wrongness of that, and put a stop to it, and built it back up in a new manner that felt right. Thereafter they did not move singly and of their own accord, but in groups, with all the leaves in a particular area suddenly taking flight, and traveling in the same direction for some distance before settling down again. At first the movement was in straight lines, but as the change deepened, and most leaves disappeared, never to return, the remaining ones began to whirl about in loose gyres that would scrape and tumble over the green grass for some distance before disassembling and falling to the ground for a time.